Hello, class. So this is how I approached teaching about the four Gospels in like a high school world history course. Okay, so we're going this from a historical overview, not from the view specifically of a believer. The four Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So Matthew was written either second or third, and it was traditionally ascribed to the Apostle Matthew. And what a book of the Bible being traditionally ascribed to somebody versus who literally wrote it are not always the same thing. However, but traditionally this has been ascribed to Matthew, and it was written for a Jewish audience because as Christianity was relatively new, it was dealing with the identity of both Jews and Gentiles. Now, the one that we know was written first is Mark. Okay, and so traditionally is ascribed to John Mark, a traveling companion of the Apostle Peter. Possibly this idea that Peter may have been illiterate. So Mark was writing down what Peter said. It's definitely the first one written. The theology is a lot less formed than the other Gospels. And you have Luke, which is written second or third. Okay, Matthew or Luke, depending on what type of scholar you're talking about, which order you would put them. It is traditionally ascribed to Luke the physician and was written for Gentiles. There's also the book of the Acts of the Apostles, and Luke and Acts may have been a single document with the same writer. It was written for Gentiles. So these were a non-Jewish audience that were brought into the fold by the message of Jesus. And so the early church had to deal with such disagreements between them. And so these are two different advantages. And then you have John, which was definitively written last. It was traditionally ascribed to John the Apostle. And it's very different in style than the other three. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are described as being synoptic gospels, where it's like a synopsis. It's just saying a recap of like what happened to them, straightforward. John's written in a very different way, a very different type of poetry, and it's just kind of doing its own thing. It has by far the most developed theology as things have progressed across time. So a lot of these numbers, it's going to really depend on what the scholars are, and I'm generally going for earlier numbers rather than later. But Mark, the earliest is 67 AD. Then there is something that we know as the Q source, which I'll get to more in just a moment, which is possibly older than Mark. Matthew and Luke were relatively around the same time, somewhere between 70 and 80 AD. They're related, but they don't know about each other. And then John's written later, between 90 and 100 AD. His acts to all of them, John may have been even later than these numbers. So let's think of the two-source hypothesis. And this has to do with like the similarities and differences that you find in the Gospels. So it is clear that Matthew and Luke have access to Mark. There are also things that are found in Matthew and Luke that are not found in Mark, but are very similar to one another. So the idea is there's some source lost now to history that both Matthew and Luke had access to. And of course, there are elements of Matthew and Luke that are uniquely theirs. The story of the shepherds and the angels singing them at Jesus' birth. And that's only in Luke. The story of the Magi, that is only in Mark. All right, so that's what I have for you guys